And so with emerging diseases, this image is showing you diseases all around the world. You have the local health departments managing populations in their region. You have the state health departments managing or overseeing the number of infectious disease outbreaks in their particular state. And you have CDC monitoring everything in the USA to look for emerging diseases. But you also have the World Health Organization, which also plays a role in sharing information and getting that out to the public, so that way we know what emerging diseases are happening. And so when we start to see diseases popping up in the U.S. and Sudan and Australia and China and India and Russia, when we start seeing diseases pop up everywhere, and they're the same diseases, we refer to that as a pandemic. And so pandemic is essentially a disease that's occurring at epidemic proportions, which means a lot of people are being infected at a very short period of time. And the pandemic takes place in many different countries at the same time. So an example is that of influenza, the Spanish flu from 1918, targeted and killed more than 20 million people all over the world. 500,000 in the US. And then another example is that of the swine flu, which was our pandemic that we had in 2009 and 2010. In individuals that monitor these flu cycles that we undergo, they have seen in the data that there is kind of this high-low, high-low. So what we could probably expect for the next few years is another influenza epidemic or pandemic that might take place. HIV and AIDS is a pandemic. Again, a lot of people infected in many different countries at the same time. Tuberculosis is also considered a pandemic, as well as malaria. So again, a pandemic is a disease that is occurring at epidemic proportions in many countries at the same time. And here's kind of an outline or timeline of influenza throughout history. So as I told you before, we kind of have a high-low kind of timeline with influenza. And so the H1N1 is suspected to be the same flu that was considered to be the 1918 Spanish flu that wiped out so many people. And then a couple years go by, and then we have 1957 through 1958, we have an Asian flu pandemic that begins. And this is due to H2N2. And then a couple more years go by, and you have H3N2, where you have a flu outbreak in Hong Kong between 1968 and 69. And so you're essentially, from this data, we're seeing that we have a 1-year flu outbreak, another 1-year flu outbreak, and then 1977 we see incidents of the Russian flu or pandemic Russian flu. And we also have H5N1, which took place in 1997, H9N2 in 1999, H7N2 2002, H5N1, H7N7, H7N2, H9N2, H5N1, H7N3, H10N7. All of these particular flus, what's interesting about them is you can see that there's a high increase in the number of influenzas that are being termed as pandemics, and they're all taking place within a year's time. On this scale, we're kind of seeing some gaps. Well, this could be due to a couple of things. It could be due to the fact that we have more technologies that have been developed that enable us to determine that we have a variation of flu viruses that are out there. The H5N1, the H generally stands for human gluten factor, and then the N1 stands for another factor that's actually on the influenza virus. And so the viruses are designated with these different terms based on their structures. So that could be one of the reasons we're seeing more of them, is because we have more technological capabilities to detect them. Another reason could be we have some sort of evolution that's taking place with influenza, and we're seeing it becoming a lot more diverse and evolving a lot more. So there could be a number of reasons, but these are some of the significant dates that outline influenza and use influenza as a good model to understand what a pandemic is. Okay. We want to determine whether or not an infectious disease is going to take place. And to kind of understand that, we have to observe the pathogens in the environment as well as the hosts that are being impacted. So factors are one thing that is going to dictate whether or not infectious disease will take place. So factors pertaining to the pathogen, this is going to include essentially how dangerous or how pathogenic is the pathogen. So how virulent is it? How is it able to infect a patient? Can it do it very quickly? Does it do it very slowly? How efficient is the pathogen? How does it do this? Is the pathogen airborne? Do you need to eat it in order to become infected? Do you have to inject it into your skin? Do you acquire the pathogen through sexual intercourse? Those are factors that are going to dictate whether or not the infection is going to be able to resume inside of a patient. How is the infectious agent spread? Is it spread through being breathed in, through being eaten? Again, is it through tactile touch? So the mode of entry of the infectious agents is pretty important as well. And then the number of organisms that are needed to induce infection is also critical. Factors pertaining to the host. So the host has to have some attributes that enable infectious agents to take over the host or infect the host. And things that dictate this are the nutritional status of a patient, the patient's hygiene, the patient's age, whether or not the patient travels, their lifestyles. A lot of different factors can influence whether or not patients will succumb to infection through a pathogen. And factors that pertain to the environment, climate, season. We tend to get a lot more sick in the winter months. Geographic location, so depending on where you are, availability of appropriate reservoirs. So these are reservoirs of areas where you can have pathogens kind of harboring and festering. So something like anything that is spread via mosquitoes could essentially be alleviated by eliminating stagnant water sources where mosquitoes like to lay their eggs. And the larvae hatch and they become mosquitoes, and then they can transmit diseases. Those reservoirs are important for the mosquitoes to use, but they're also important for the pathogens to use in order to spread their genes. Sanitation is a big attribute that is going to influence the environment's role in spreading diseases, as well as having potable water. Now, let's look at one example of kind of a combination of environment, the pathogen, as well as host. So a good example is that of the tick. And what happens with a tick is that it's going to lay its eggs on the ground. And once these eggs hatch, you're going to have these little tick larvae that are going to attach themselves to a rodent, such as a rat. And when it attaches to the rat, the larvae start to pick up a blood meal from the rat. And in picking up this blood meal, the larvae start to get the organism that can cause Lyme disease. And so once the larvae end up having a bacterial parasite inside of them called Burgdorfia burgdorferi, this particular tick typically is going to fall off the rat and then come into contact with a new host organism. And at this stage, the tick has basically gone from its larva stage to a nymph stage. And so the nymphs start to feed off another host organism, such as a squirrel or a human. And after feeding from these organisms, the nymph is going to drop off of the host. And once it drops off the host, it's going to make its way to a larger host, such as a deer. And at this point, the nymph has matured into an adult. It takes on a mate, and once it takes on a mate, you have the basically reproduction process of eggs. And so you have males and females that start to be generated. Now, the males eventually will die off, but the females will go on to spread their offspring. And when doing so, the eggs, you're going to have more eggs developed, and then this whole life cycle essentially is going to get passed on. So as these ticks are going through this stage and taking blood meal from one organism, and blood meal from another organism, and then blood meal from another organism, you have the infection of the Lyme disease agent that is going to take that organism and infect it into another host organism, and then infect it into another host organism. And so the process continues to be repeated over and over. So that's kind of an example of the interactions that it can exist between the pathogen, the host, and the environment. Now, we have something called the 6 components in an infectious disease process, also known as the chain reaction. And those 6 components, or the chain of infection, sorry, not chain reaction, those 6 components consist of the pathogen, the source of the pathogen or the reservoir, the portal of exit, so how that pathogen leaves the system, and then how it's transmitted into a new system, how it enters that system, and how it makes that host susceptible to the pathogen. This diagram here just kind of highlights health professions and the role that is played by infectious agents. So infectious agents, we have all of the microorganisms that we've talked about in the class, protozoans, fungi, viruses, bacteria, and then another group of organisms that are a little bit smaller, Rickettsia, which are still essentially bacteria. They are going to essentially cause infection. People acquire these infections through the use of reservoirs. The reservoirs the pathogen have to leave these reservoirs and then undergo a portal of entry, making a host very susceptible to the disease brought on by the pathogen. Other factors are means of transmission, so how do you come into contact with it? And then how is the organism able to kind of evade the system if needed? So we call it the portal of exit. So there's a lot of different factors that are involved in this chain reaction.